Hey folks, this week in our A Public History of the Constitution or People's History of the Constitution discussion series, we're going to be focusing on the Philadelphia Convention and the actual core document itself that came out of that. But before we do that, I wanted to go ahead and recap what we talked about last week, which was how we got there, what the road to Philadelphia was, to revisit that and dismantle the myths that still distort it for those of you who might have missed it. We framed our discussion last week on YouTube Live and on Patreon and in other places around one simple but essential question. WTF? Why was there a constitutional convention at all? Try to go ahead and essentialize these things for my students and for our community here, for our lifelong students and our lifelong study. Why was there a constitutional convention at all? 6 years after the shooting more or less stops in 1781, 4 years after the end of the Treaty of Paris that actually ended the Revolutionary War. Why? And the real answer, not the version passed down through nationalist mythology, mostly heaped on use since World War II, but a lot before that, reveals just how narrow and contingent the path to this version of the federal Constitution truly was. So here is what we covered last week. The situation after the Revolutionary War. 1783, year that the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, went into effect, and the British finally evacuated the Atlantic seaboard cities it still held, such as New York. Maintained the pesky forts in the West, though that comes a lot later. The United States were independent. The states were independent, not the states. The United States was independent, because they were each independent states, independent republics first. When we think of our country today, and this terminology is critical to actually sitting in understanding things as they were in 1783 and 1786, not thinking about it from 2026. When we think in broad national terms, we think of the United States. But in 1783, then the free white people who ran the show thought first and foremost about their states. That's what they had been fighting to make independent during the Revolutionary War. 13 independent republics that were loosely associated under a confederation for the purposes of achieving the goals of fighting the war for the most part. But that's the independence that they were thinking of. For Virginia, for Massachusetts, for New York, not necessarily for this thing that they called the United States. Their allegiance was to their breakaway republics, not to some sort of abstract national identity. That is a modern concept. Rolling back to the late 18th century, when the free white men who were in charge were primarily concerned with building those new governments in those republics, writing those new constitutions and forming their own institutions. So the Articles of Confederation reflected that reality. It was created to provide a forum for those republics. This deliberately loose confederation that, before it did anything else, first did no harm, first did not invade the sovereignty of the states, and then had just enough capacity to facilitate a few common interests, like fighting and financing the war. End of the war, end to a lot of those necessities. There was no popular demand for a stronger central government after that, or even much thought of it. In fact, the overwhelming impulse was to protect the independence that they had just fought to win. The idea that a new, stronger federal government was urgently needed was not widely shared, and that is an understatement. It was the vision of a very small number of nationalists that could barely fill a tavern snug. The second thing we covered, the nature and purpose of the Articles of Confederation. This is an easy one, but one a little bit harder for a lot of modern people to accept. The Articles of Confederation were not a failure. They did exactly what they were designed to do. Saying that they were a failure is Alexander Hamilton talking, amplified by 230 years of pretending. The Articles worked exactly as they were intended to work. They provided a common framework for cooperation without surrendering state sovereignty. The so-called problems of the 1780s, border disputes between states, the tariffs that they began to place on each other, competing currencies, paper money being a big problem, the kind of things that all independent states do. Those are challenges, and were challenges, but not threats to the survival of the United States. There was no collapse just around the corner. That is nationalist spin. There was no imminent anarchy. There was only the predictable friction of self-governing republics adjusting to a new context without having the British Empire as an external umpire to resolve disputes, which was the status before 1776. So the nationalist narrative that the country's falling apart and has to be saved because the articles are fatally flawed, oh my God, that's political spin. It's a lie told at the time that just becomes the dominant narrative because all of the other possibilities are forcefully excluded. It fits much more neatly into a nationalist story. So if you were Hamilton or Madison or Jay and walked into a European capital, say the United States is here, and have them all perk up and pay attention to you, then the articles weren't your friend. But if you're every other free white person, enslaved people still being brutalized every day, not much relief for them. But if you're a free white man, you're content, at least satisfied, with the way things were in 1783. Although the states were doing things that they weren't used to doing, like levying taxes. There were lots of them. And where did those come from? Wait a second, they hadn't been here before the war. Now they're coming through my door every day. We'll come back to that. That's where we were heading into 1786, after 3 years of independence. Financially shaky, like all countries emerging from a costly war usually are, but socially stable, especially once the possibility that enslaved people could gain freedom by running to the nearest British army was mostly eliminated. But now there was Pennsylvania and its manumission law, and Massachusetts and its court-forced abolition of slavery. We can talk about the impact of the Quock Walker case and Bet to deal with. Once they eliminate that, then things get a lot more stable because their big fear, free black people. They cut down on that, things suddenly become much more stable for free white people. The third thing we covered, the Annapolis Convention. In September 1786, an Annapolis Convention met to discuss economic issues, mainly to discuss problems of interstate trade, navigation of the Potomac, Maryland or Virginia, things like that. Only 5 states sent delegates. Well, they sent 12 delegates, which was essentially a group of people who were already meeting pretty regularly. Madison, Hamilton, and Randolph, talking about the exact same things that they had been talking about, usually in the parlor at Mount Vernon. This time, they were just doing it in Annapolis. There wasn't enough interest, there wasn't enough recognition of any kind of problems, and so therefore there wasn't enough representation to do much. Well, to do anything. Especially since what Hamilton and Madison really wanted to do was craft national solutions to these problems. United trade policy, a centralized economic regulation, national solutions that took authority from the newly independent states. They, the nationalists, were thinking big. But then in the end, in Annapolis, they only ended up talking to each other. But that gave them time to hatch a plan. They'd have another meeting. But this would be the big one for all the marbles. It's clear from the primary sources, from private letters and public statements afterward, that Hamilton and Madison in particular, and a few of their allies, would outwardly frame their proposed meeting as one to think about broader amendments to the Articles of Confederation. But they already knew and admitted that they wanted to do much, much more than that. They would frame the call for a convention in language broad enough to look legitimate and get the Confederation Congress to agree to it. But their real plan was to, from the beginning, was to erase the Articles, not improve them. Was to create a new national government and make sure that one of their own, and they're already thinking about Washington, would lead it. Now, that's not exactly a coup, and we need to come up with a better word for it. One historian, Michael Klarman, has written a wonderful book that actually calls it a coup, but I don't think that word actually fits. It's just a group of elite white guys with power, with their own idea of how to gain a bigger share of power from the other elite white guys with power. But it was pretty sneaky, especially since they had to work to arrange that enough people like them were in that room in Philadelphia. More John Jays, no Patrick Henrys. No Patrick Henrys. We also talked about 4, Shays Not Really a Rebellion. A farmers' resistance in western Massachusetts started in August 1786 and lasted through February of 1787. It is called Shays Rebellion. It was not an insurrection against legitimate authority. It was not in any way an attempt to overthrow the government, even though it's framed as that way by some at the time, by some. It was a protest movement against crushing debt, unfair taxation. Massachusetts had gotten very good at passing taxes after the war, and unjust court practices that disproportionately harmed rural people. What do you do with courts that are foreclosing on your farm, your only way to pay taxes and feed your family, because you have an inability to pay those taxes and they're not listening to you when you said the taxes were too high for you to pay? What do? You close the courts. You resort to the same tactics that you used in the resistance against the British government. You take this in your own hands, but you address the core problem. Close the courts, you do it on your own. That's Shays Resistance. It only turned violent when the Massachusetts government used overwhelming military force to shut it down. Yeah, there was violence, especially when Shays tried to grab the armory at Springfield. And there were deaths, but every single fatality was caused by the Massachusetts government forces, and then through executions of a few of the resistors. Yet the nationalists, like Henry Knox and Washington, and now John Adams, because Shays Resistance scares a lot of the older folks to death, they start exaggerating it into a symbol of anarchy to create a false sense of national crisis that helped justify their broader agenda. They needed that kind of spark. We're not only encountering problems from overseas, we are now facing problems from domestic insurrection. And they will return to that exact example, and that only example, as Exhibit A over and over and over again over the next year, particularly all throughout the ratifying convention. The danger of the Shayites. So whenever you hear that part of the oath that says all enemies foreign and domestic, the domestic part is the ghost of Daniel Shays. But calling it a rebellion was not honest then, and it's not honest now. Doing that just continues to sing the nationalist tune. 5. The Confederation Congress's authorization of a convention. We got there. We got to get our chronology straight. So now we've gone from August of 1786 when Shays Rebellion starts, and September of 1786 when the Annapolis Convention was held, and then the plan is hatched for a federal convention in order to be able to, in Hamilton and Madison's view, actually create a new government. And then in February, after sort of the end of Shays Rebellion, in that context, as Shays was being trampled, near the end of February 1787, the Confederation Congress met in order to authorize the convention in Philadelphia. There was no enthusiasm for it. There was no groundswell of support for it. And its explicit purpose was limited to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. It did not authorize the creation of an entirely new frame of government. And as a lot of people said at the time, had anybody in fact known that it was, then they would have sent other people and it would have turned out quite differently. It did not authorize abandoning the Articles. It was a limited mandate, and one that the Philadelphia Convention quickly and deliberately ignored, because the pushers for it had that exactly in their plans. They were ready from day one. And so who were the key players who pushed their invented solution? So at Philadelphia, once we get there, then they take over. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, Gouverneur Morris and their allies, backed by George Washington's prestige, which they desperately needed, in order to make sure that there wasn't another replay of the Annapolis Convention where nobody would show up. Washington's presence was crucial for anyone else to take it seriously, particularly the nationalists, and the nationalists in the other states. they who steered the convention towards a radical break, especially once they maneuvered for their enemies to stay away. Again, Patrick Henry, for example, wrote that he smelled a rat and stayed away. A huge mistake for the opponents. One they would later regret, but not one they would make again, and we'll get to that. So the delegates didn't represent popular will at all. They represented their own. They weren't trying to restore revolutionary principles, quite the contrary. This was entirely about the architecture of a new government cut off from what they saw as the chains of their history, even their recent history. The only history that mattered to them was the history created since 1776. They were in a whole new world, which required a whole new system designed to achieve order, secure property, and project national power abroad, and then contain that domestic unrest. They defined a problem for them to solve, immediately proclaiming that the Articles were unworkable, unfixable. They had no choice but to start from scratch. This band of once-in-a-millennium geniuses, they just couldn't do it. So they framed a fictional crisis. The nation's falling apart, it's about to collapse into violence. The nations of Europe are about to carve it up and gobble it, just waiting to take their share. They were just going to break down into licentiousness. And then they presented their constitution as the only viable solution, and they stuck to that story. But the key for us, particularly moving forward, is to recognize that none of that was inevitable, none of it was foreordained, none of it was a miracle. It could have turned out a number of different ways and been just fine. They could have just revised the Articles of Confederation. Washington, after the ratifying conventions, looked at only one part of the Constitution, which was its power to levy direct taxes on people, and said that if we don't get that power, then we might as well go under the Confederation keep going under the Confederation because the Constitution doesn't matter. So getting to Philadelphia was the key political victory for the nationalists, not a historical necessity. So this week, as we prepare to dig into the Philadelphia Convention and the Constitution it produced, no amendments, 3/5 clause, Fugitive Slave Act, direct taxation, it's critical to take a few wins out of the sails of the modern mythmakers. The Articles of Confederation did not fail. They simply didn't serve nationalist ambitions. The United States was not on the brink of collapse. The Constitution was not the only way forward. And the Constitution was not the natural culmination of the American Revolution. The Bill of Rights was. So it was one contested outcome among many possibilities. It became dominant because of the political skill of the nationalists, the folks whom we call the framers, and because of the language and mythology they crafted to defend it afterwards. So understanding the road to Philadelphia clears the ground. It lets us approach the Philadelphia Convention with a sharper eye, not reverence, but reality. We're here to lay out the facts, and then what you do with it is up to you. But the real story of the Constitution isn't about inevitability. It's about choices over power, and it's about who got to make them. So join us this week.